What's up, guys? Figured I'd jump on for a second and answer some of the Run At Once questions from the members. The way that I'm going to be doing the Q&A this summer is going to be shorter. I'm going to spread it out through platforms. So like sometimes I'll do a Facebook, leave it open for questions for a few days and then stream it. Sometimes it'll be just for Run At Once. Either way, it'll end up all on here. And then it'll get thrown up on YouTube sometime after that. Looks like everything's going well with the audio, so I'm going to jump right in. 3 questions that I really want to answer. I guess I'll start with this one because it's kind of fun. Hey, Nick. Given that poker players have traditionally been given nicknames such as Action Dan, NE2 Stu, etc., you always advocate that simplification of strategy is good. How would you feel about being known to the poker community as Simple Nick? I think I'd be honored. I think that'd be a powerful legacy. Let's do it. It's up to you guys, though. I can't make that happen. Here's a question that I love. I'm going to abbreviate it and get straight to the point. Nick, you've talked openly about hitting rock bottom as the inciting incident for changing your mindset and redirecting your career. Many players go through a rock bottom period and search for a new path, but they often don't find the success that you did. Humbled. Thank you. Why do you feel you were able to turn things around for yourself while other equally well-intending and competent people struggle to find the momentum in the direction that they want? If you have that, quote, other thing as a competitor or as a person, what would it be? I have been talking a lot about simplicity on the blog, as that guy noted right above. It's been sort of my main theme to start the summer off, and part of simplifying is about coming back to reality. I mentioned on an Instagram post yesterday that, would you believe it if I told you that if I'm in a hand analysis with someone, that 50% of their analysis isn't even true, and that 50% of it might not even be real at all? And by true, I mean like it's not helping them, it's not objective. And by not real, I mean like they're real far out there with just projecting weird shit onto their reality, what the other player might think of them, like really non-scientific observations that they're using to base their decisions on. So how does this connect to finding direction as a person who's struggling to clarify things and get on a healthier path? I think when I remember my rock bottom experience, what I remember is the pure and utter burnout, first of all. But I remember this very interesting part of it, which was a loss of interest in telling the same stories that I had been telling myself that allowed me to keep pushing in the same insistent direction that hadn't been working. And I remember there was a very clear distinction that I made around that time, like this 1 week period especially, where I kept waking up and I was developing more and more awareness that there was these stories running in my head that didn't exactly pertain to reality, but it was my convenient version of reality. It was convenient for me to overlay these stories that allowed me to continue to rationalize for a not so smart path. So I think what I might have, and this obviously happens in iterations and cycles, where a person gets smarter and then dumber and then learns a new lesson on a deeper level. And that process continues, like for sure it does. There's no stopping it. You're always feeling like you discovered a blind spot. No matter how aware you get, you'll always have that realization where something totally stuns you and you feel like you're back at square one. But what I might have developed through my burnout experience is a higher sensitivity to when I'm actually bullshitting myself. What I think I started to realize was, because of how much pain I'm in around my burnout period, I started to have a dialogue with myself that was very real, and it went something like this. Something is clearly wrong here. And I mean that from the way that I felt in my body. It became very hard to deny that something about how reality was working in my world was very, very off compared to what I felt was normal. compared to maybe how I felt when I was younger, compared to how I felt when there wasn't as much stress or as much torment or inner conflict. I had some sort of comparison to know that things had gotten very bad. And I think that was the factor that I couldn't ignore. And if you want to call that a skill, then so be it. Maybe it's some sort of sensitivity to the fact that reality is currently fucked. And there's an admission that has to happen that maybe this could be that I'm the culprit. Maybe the way I'm perceiving my situation is actually the reason why reality seems to be so out of whack. And by following that strand and taking it deeper and deeper into the depths of humility and really starting to challenge belief systems head on, maybe that's what I did that was a little bit more direct than other people who might be smart and smarter than me, but not facing themselves as directly. So it really starts to challenge what is the real definition of intelligence, because you can have all the book smarts in the world, and if you're faced with a complicated enough model, which is sort of what happened with me with like the GTO thing, I think there's very few people in the world who can solve that and then implement it in a way that still feels practical. Maybe that's what we're looking at with the top players in the world, is just like such genius minds that they're able to implement way closer to optimal strategies on the regular, from studying and remembering and then being able to apply in real time. I wasn't that smart, and I burned myself out with an overcomplicated model. And the only thing that brought me back to independent learning in a way that was practical and scalable was that moment where I said, something's very wrong. I need to fix it, and I can't rationalize for continuing to go in the same direction here. So maybe that's the thing, is the ability to sense that something's wrong with reality and that you have a large enough sample to justify making a change. I think that sample size is really important too. If you've been watching any of my content, I don't know if you guys are members of Elliot Roe's Academy. It may be the only place I've debuted it yet. I have this new cycle that I'm sort of showing. It's actually probably in the Run It Once blog, sort of the flip cycle that people go through, where it sort of explains how people tilt. And I think getting to that point of surrender, which is the notable point of burnout, is the indicator of a rock bottom, or at least a cycling towards rock bottom. That was definitely the place that I was in. And gaining awareness around not just that cycle, but how that cycle perpetuates itself even once you get good at it. Like every new theme that you face, you will go through another iteration of that cycle. And the only question is, how intelligently do you move through it? And so it's like that intelligence thing is a very weird question, because I definitely was tested and failed to prove myself intelligently by book smart terms. When I approached the GTO model, I couldn't do it. And maybe that is what woke me up to potentially a higher dimension or a higher definition of intelligence, which could be seen as applying oneself practically with systems that are scalable for your capacity as a person, for your learning capacity. So will I ever be able to play like a bot, assuming bots ever get to the point where they can play perfect GTO? Hell no. But can I try to cut corners by doing things that are practical and minimize the game tree, and use mass data analysis to try to refine my exploits in spots where I have really scientific edge? Sure, I can do that. And I can make winning simpler than most people are making it by just being honest about where my strengths are. So my strengths were sort of as a practitioner, or someone who's interested in making things practical. And from that, by following that strand, you just start to evolve your methodology. And so then from there, maybe the only other thing that I have is an allegiance, or a really keen desire to remain consistent when I'm building something. I was talking to someone the other day that if you're an innovator, if you're a strategy innovator, which a lot of guys are, some of the brightest minds are guys that really enjoy just innovating new strategy, you will find if you do it for long enough, that building your own methodology is much like building your own tiny kingdom. There's the map, there's the layout, there's the terrain, and then it's your job to start building bridges. Picture like all the water on the land. A bridge needs to be built over every piece of water to connect land to each other. So the way I visualize this is, as you start to build bridges and you have more and more bridges in your kingdom, if you ever get to a point where two bridges are sort of overlapping and crossing each other, that's a problem, because it's showing that there's a contradiction somewhere previous in your methodology. This is just sort of how I visualize it. And I was always very aware of, if a contradiction arises when I'm building my methodology, that's my indicator that I need to go back and figure out what was inconsistent at a previous point. You want to have a really consistent foundation. Otherwise, you're never going to build the kingdom up to a place that's workable, livable, scalable, smooth. There's too much friction if there's contradictions, and people have a really hard time learning in a contradictory environment, as they should, because certain things aren't making sense fundamentally. It's not that you're, approaching paradoxes where certain things that contradict actually have higher balance. No, I mean, like, there are certain things that are fundamentally contradictory. There's no balance to it. So you got to avoid having stuff like that in your own innovation process. So maybe that would be my other edge. Once I got back on my feet, I was very sensitive to making sure that my thought process was consistent as I build it. You guys heard me talk about hyper-analysis. It was the method that I used to sort of refine my consistency in spoken analysis. I would sit down with a microphone looking at an old hand, and I would do iteration, take after take, of microphone analysis, where I would listen to it after, try to adjust and make a better analysis the next time. And by the end of it, I'd have maybe 3 to 5 recordings where I could listen to them all, take the pieces of each that I liked, throw out what I didn't like, and I would end up with sort of this hyper analysis. That was my gear for a while, and I got really good just by doing that before I even started to put anything really on paper. I had a lot of hands recorded that I felt like, who is this guy speaking? Like, who's this new? What's this new mind that I've accessed, where if I do this enough and piece these things together, I'm almost speaking like a different person. I got very much in touch with my authenticity as a speaker and as a thinker. I stopped being interested in saying and telling stories that I knew were compensating for needing to feel like I had to have the answer. I got very in touch with when I was saying stuff that I had just read in a forum and I was just regurgitating it, because even when I'm alone in a room, I'm afraid of saying something that might be wrong. Like, you got to get over all of that. And the hyper-analysis method is a really cool way to do it. I gave an announcement recently that I'm opening one-on-one coaching again, sort of at the end of the month, I think. And it's almost specifically because I have a few ideas of a format that I really, really am interested in testing out. This hyper-analysis format is one of them. Basically, I'm going to have students send in their own hyper-analysis, and I will give you the adjusted feedback after sort of tinkering with all of your versions. So if you're into this type of training, it's going to be the advanced module of the one-on-one stuff that I offer. But if that type of thing is something you're into, you need to contact me, because I want to work with you. It's an extremely humble process, and it's not for everyone. But for the guys that can handle the direct feedback and handle how frustrating it can be to get in touch with yourself authentically when you're doing analysis, we got to talk, because it's a top-notch way to challenge yourself, especially like under performance stress. You wouldn't believe it, but like when you're analyzing a hand, you're on mic and you're going to submit it to your coach. Like, there's a certain amount of performance stress there still. There's also that 30-second exercise that's part of that format. I debuted that on Run It Once. I literally simulate a high-pressure situation where I'll show you a hand that maybe you have or haven't seen. I'll put you on the clock, and I will listen to your data point analysis, and you have 30 seconds as if it's real-time play to get the consistent data analysis organized and make your decision. And then I'll analyze how well you did and give you basically deconstructed analysis of where I think you're going wrong and what paths you're going down that aren't efficient. And eventually I'll give you what I believe to be the consistent data point analysis that's going to give you the best decision. Okay, cool. Thanks for that, Matt. That's an awesome question. I hope I did it justice. Hi, Nick. I have a question with regards to your take on strategy development for heads-up play. Joy. I recently bought your PO Unlocked pack. It's amazing stuff. Congrats. I've been loving it so far. It's certainly made my exploration of PO Solver much more enjoyable. With that said, my question, I'd like to ask, in what ways would you go about applying and adapting the protocol of that pack into a heads-up environment, where often we're dealing with very wide ranges and common lines, and there's less room for whole-scale simplification? I would start by challenging the second point. I think you can still play a relatively simplified strategy in terms of minimizing the game tree. There's a lot of strategy suggestions in PO Unlocked, like just one that sort of became well-known that I was recommending for a while is the 1/3 flop c-bet. You do it with your whole range, so you only pick one strategy option as the in-position c-better, and it really condenses the game tree and makes your life very easy. You can still do that in heads up. You can still use a 1/3 range strategy. Now, that strategy is exploitable, but the exploit is quite hard to implement, and especially when ranges are wide, it's potentially still going to give you edge over anybody but a very good opponent who tries to check raise exploit you constantly. The thing about heads up that you have to be careful about if you're implementing what I would call strategy simplifications, or if you have blueprint type strategies that are geared toward mass data analysis findings where people are overfolding, most of that is consistent with heads up and sometimes even more prevalent, especially versus the overly passive competition. I think just over aggression in itself is clearly the winning strategy. But meta comes into the play. So with meta comes everything like the opponent is observing that you might be taking certain lines more abusively, and this becomes much more, and I mean much more relevant versus smart players than it is in 6 or 9 max. You can see those videos. There's probably a bunch of them I made that's like trying to get the point across to you that in full ring or 6 max even, you're not as special as you think you are at the table. You haven't played enough hands with most of your opponents to be having the type of paranoid thoughts that you're having about how they're maximally exploiting you because you've taken the same line 3 times with a bluff. With heads up, it can be different. Depends on the quality of your opponent. You need to be more careful about taking hard exploits, especially in bloated pots, because it's very easy for an observant opponent to say, it's time to throw the hammer down because Nick's frequencies are out of control, and I'm aware of what reasonable frequencies look like, and I'm agitated, so I'm just going to start bluff catching more, for instance. So you have less room to be super reckless almost with your aggression, where I think in 6 and 9 max, for the most part, except against the very best regs, you can usually apply aggression in these hotspot territories and have good success, because remember, hotspot zones, which are zones that are proven over tens and hundreds of millions of hands of samples to be high fold equity zones, even versus regs, those zones exist because they're the zones that most regs aren't even aware they're overfolding. So that's something to let sit with you for a second. If you're this guy that's paranoid that these lines that you think are really successful regularly are not going to perform as well versus good regs, start to realize that probably less regs than you think are even aware of what a solid defense frequency looks like in that zone that you're targeting. That can be a big perspective shift. Now, I'm not saying that you're never going to get exploited. I think you are, but you have to decide if you're getting exploited enough to stop implementing a strategy that could potentially be printing money against a really high percentage of the pool. I'll release a video later this month. I found that it's from like 2016 where I spoke about this specific thing right after we put PO Pack 2 out, before the Night Vision Pack, where it's like too many guys are trying to devise a strategy that makes them the best reg at the limit. And what it manifests as is you trying to over-adjust your strategy to beat every player based on your perception of what that player thinks of you, or some weird leveling war. So to wrap this question up on that note, I would say the simplifications are for the most part going to be effective, especially in the aggression territories where mass data analysis is suggesting to bluff too often. What you have to be worried about is getting into these really intense leveling wars. Is something that I'm still guilty of because the game tree of heads up is so dynamic, and because there's so much room for people to play back at each other, and because there's such, especially if you're a creative player, there's this tendency to want to project that your opponent has recognized an adjustment that you've made or something you've been pounding on him for, and that he's playing back, and now you want to play back at that. Like, that is the biggest alarm that should go off. If you're showing anybody your hands, or if you're looking for a second opinion, the first thing I would look at is how often are you making very large deviations to your normal strategy on a hunch that you're like recountering some meta that occurred. It's extremely dangerous because it leads you down a path of deviation that ends up being a very slippery slope, because now you're moving away from your standard strategy. Now you're projecting a ton onto your reality, and with every next iteration of information exchange, you're potentially getting really spun out. You're struggling for control very hard, and you're teetering on the edge of getting very frustrated with not even knowing where the meta's at, because you get so spun. And then by that point, you're in a very self-destructive state that most players are not even consciously aware that they teeter into. This is the cause of basically subconscious tilt, but most tilt is subconscious. It's when you get into a struggle for control to continue to change your strategy to try to one-up the opponent, which in heads up is very prevalent. And then eventually what ends up happening is you get confused, overwhelmed, frustrated, to the point where you do something like make a bluff catch that you would never make under the circumstance on this texture and this spot, because you think this guy's like fucking with you or something. Those are the real tilt zones. I played a match earlier this year with a guy where I got really beat up doing that type of stuff. It was over like maybe a 5,000 hand sample. It was over maybe 5 days, 5,000 hands of heads up. And I came away from it with a way more expanded awareness over this mindset trap of continually needing to be the one who's in control of the match. It's like a very over-aggressive imbalance where you constantly are trying to take data points of what the opponent is doing and filter that through some sort of need to be in charge of the aggression or the fold equity or just the win rate of the match in general. And you start to have all these weird rationalizations. And the only reason I actually stumbled upon how bad I played in these 5,000 hands was because I was filming everything and I was going back to watch film. Specifically when it's in real time, you can sense it more than looking at just random hand histories. You can do that too, but I really like watching the film. And what I noticed was I had this weird tendency to just be playing way differently in zones where the match was progressing. And this is versus a good player too, like a specialist. And you're getting into all these zones where you guys are fighting back with wide ranges, like you said in the initial question. And there's all of this room for you to start projecting things. And I was guilty of it. And I found it in this footage. And I was like, holy shit, this is big. Because this is a blind spot that I think almost every innovator, anybody who defaults towards wanting to be the innovator and having that intuitive sense and then trusting it too much without high enough sample size, changing too many variables at once, heads up puts all of that into such a accelerated experience. It's like the same as what Bitcoin was. Anybody who was in Bitcoin experienced maybe 20 years of market volatility in the 6-month period, just because the catalyst was so intense in that market. Heads up is like that. It's like you can have such an awareness build over your core imbalances through a 5,000 hand match, just because there's so many data points. There's so much that you're being tested on in terms of your ability to be consistent in your logic. Instead of rationalizing for deviations that are more or less usually ungrounded. So that would be my main, caution or caveat to heads up, is that if you are someone who approaches heads up by being the type of guy who can't wait to level your opponent, if 100 hands in, I'm going to have so much information on him that I'll just be able to constantly level him. Godspeed, because there are very, very few players who are intuitively gifted enough that I think will be very successful with that type of approach. And there are many for every one of you that's that gifted, there's 100 of you that will burn yourself out and end up in a really distorted cognitive tunnel trying to win that battle. And I think for the most part, what's happened is you're going to get put in your place by players who are more consistent and solid and who are recognizing that you're lunging for control. Guilty as charged. What type of streams are you doing this summer? I sort of answered this in the blog. Lately, I'm doing a lot more Instagram stuff that's just like straight up 1 minute. Really challenging myself to come up with an idea, distill it down to 1 minute, and just launch it in an Instagram post, because that's the length of time they give you. So my format lately is going to be stuff like Q&A like this, maybe 15, 30 minutes max, and then really short posts, like daily doses of powerful case study wisdom, stuff that I've gleaned over coaching the stable, or stuff like I just said about like the heads up traps, stuff about bankroll management that we have new awareness over by being able to watch how a lot of guys function, stuff about how stop losses work and why they don't work. A lot of different revelations that have come from just being in a space more of listening, running a company and having an eagle-eye view on how things are working and not working. Just insights, just tons of mindset insights in general that I think can be compressed into tiny little nuggets that if I just keep dosing you guys with, I'm probably doing the best thing that I can, maybe giving much more value than I could if I asked you to watch a 1 hour speech, even though those are cool too. I'm really into this quick shot format. All right, last question. Nick, I saw you talking a lot about the apps, the poker apps in the past, playing on them. I didn't find anything in Poker Detox applications where it tells where your students are going to play. Can you answer this? Who decides it, you or your team or the students? For the entirety that we've had CFP so far, we've had our players on the apps. That would have been from summer of 2017 onward. The apps were very good to us for a period of time. I think that they're falling off in 2018. Every angle that I get feedback from has been mentioning something worse about the apps in one way or another in terms of the games being too reg infested. So it seems as if that market is beginning to dry up from everything I can tell and the sources that I have. That being said, I still think that the game should be beatable, but actively I'm looking for other sites to move my guys to, specifically my strongest players first. So it's sort of a group decision. It's obviously the executives have a good idea of who we want to move over in terms of just the value of our investment on other sites, especially with the high stakes situation on the apps right now. It's really not what it used to be. There was a collusion issue. So we're actively sort of scanning for other high stakes environments to put our best players into. But more than anything, I think it's not really like I would force anybody to play where they didn't want to play. It's sort of more of an issue of like, okay, where do you live? What sites do you have options for? What are the rake back options? That's a consideration too. Just what type of volume can you play on certain sites is kind of a big thing. So for the most part, it's not a decided thing. We used to be all in on the apps because it was just sort of where the market seemed to be incentivizing us to play. But recently, I'm definitely more open about different site options for new deployed players. So far, the applications look like super stellar. There's 3 guys already. I can say this. There's 3 guys already in the top 25 that I would be very surprised if we didn't sign contracts with them. That being said, I don't want that to discourage anybody from sending a contract in, because that would just be disqualifying yourself for no reason. But what I can say is the quality of the applications this time around has been much better. Probably the best it's ever been. And I mean like really good. Like some of the applications look like these kids are like applying for college. Like literally that's how long they are. So really impressed and super humbled and grateful to be in a position where like I'm the guy who has to make the decision on like where these people's journeys take them in terms of contracts. And it's just crazy. Like thinking back to the whole rock bottom thing like 2-3 years ago, I would have never expected this reality to stare that one in the face and say, this is like 2.5 years away. Like it literally feels like a time warp, and it's nuts. So applications will stay open until June 14th for that. I'll make more announcements about the one-on-one coaching and just other packages that are coming out over the summer, because we're making sort of just a real big content push overall. And like, I really just want this to be a summer where everybody who wants to hop on my content, like come back to reality with me. I've tried to start a movement with Detox that tries to make the independent learner more humble and more rational in the way that you think. And like the transition that I'm trying to head into this summer is like a real mindset shift where we have the technical taken care of. If you're into the mass database stuff, I personally think it's a very scientific, objective way to simplify your strategy and get fast results while not sacrificing a theoretical understanding of the game. I think it's sort of the best of both worlds. That's one other thing I would say about Heads Up is you'll find yourself more in sequences as opposed to simplifications. There's different types of sequences similar to maybe sequences that guys who fight or are in MMA are familiar with, where it's the sequence that exposes your understanding of theory, because you have to dissect how has he actually adjusted based on showdown. For instance, if you're check raising exploitatively, someone starts 3-betting you or someone starts floating you wide, well, then you might want to start check raising merged. Stuff like that, where like the theoretical understanding is required for you to deploy the right exploit. But I digress. Most of the content that I really want to focus on is like, how can I make you understand that winning is simpler? Whether you're coming at it from a theoretical or an exploitative point of view, we can simplify it from any angle. If you actually get that mindset is operating almost on a higher level of relevance than anything you're doing technically. I said in the recent Elliot podcast, would you believe that it's 2018 and the next upgrade in your game that's going to give you the most win rate is not technical? That upgrade's going to be mental. So stay with me. Follow me on Facebook, Instagram. I'm going to be dropping all those videos daily through those platforms, and then it'll all end up over on YouTube too. Appreciate you guys asking questions. Anything I can continue to do to bring clarity to the struggle, you have my full attention. I'll continue to run it once Q&A, and also you can catch me over at Facebook. I'll just go back and forth between them. It's always been one of my favorite formats, and the quality of questions are always really high. So thank you, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.